Hello listeners. This is the reading of the Sabbath School lesson for the fourth and final quarter of 2022.
The series is titled On Death, Dying and the Future Hope. The author is Dr. Alberto Tim, while your readers are Percy and Sibylla Harrold. Welcome to lesson number 8, ready for teaching on November 19. It's titled The New Testament Hope, and I'm Percy Harrold. Tuesday, November 15, I will raise him up. In one of his miracles, Jesus fed 5,000 people with just a small amount of bread and fish, as recorded in John 6, verses 1 to 14. Perceiving that the multitude then intended to proclaim him king in verse 15, Jesus sailed with his disciples to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But the next day the multitude followed him there, where he delivered his powerful sermon on the bread of life, with special emphasis on the gift of everlasting life. And that's recorded in John 6, 22 to 59. Read John 6, 26 to 51. How did Jesus associate the gift of everlasting life with the final resurrection of the righteous? John 6, beginning at verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labour for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Then they said to him, What shall we do, that we may work the works of God? Jesus answered and said to them, This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. Therefore they will say to him, What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. The Jews then complained about him because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And they said, Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he says, I have come down from heaven? Jesus therefore answered and said to them, Do not murmur among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. In his sermon, Jesus highlighted three basic concepts in regard to eternal life. First, he identified himself as the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And we read that in verse 33, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. We also read it in verse 58. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. By declaring that I am, the Greek ego eimi, the bread of life, as recorded in John 6:35 and 48, Jesus presented himself as the great I am of the Old Testament. John 6 verse 35, and Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And verse 48, I am the bread of life. Jesus presented himself as the great I am of the Old Testament. You'll remember that in Exodus 3 verse 14. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Second, Jesus explained that everlasting life can be secured in him. He who comes to me and he who believes in me will have this blessing in verse 35. And finally, Jesus linked the gift of immortality with the final resurrection, assuring his audience 3 times, and I will raise him up at the last day. We read that in verse 40, and this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. And verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. And verse 54, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Jesus also gave this amazing promise. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. John 6:47. So the gift of eternal life is already a present reality. But this does not mean that the believer will never die, for the very expression raise him up in verse 40 presupposes coming back to life after one has died. The picture is clear. Without Christ, one does not have eternal life. But even after accepting Christ and having the assurance of eternal life, we continue for now being mortal and therefore subject to natural death. At the second coming, Jesus will resurrect us, and then and there he will give us the gift of immortality that was ours already. The gift is assured, not because of a supposed natural immortality of the soul, but rather because of the righteousness of Jesus that comes to us by faith in him. And so to finish today, dwell on the words of Jesus that if you believe in him, you have, as in right now, eternal life. How can this wonderful promise help you deal with the painful reality of our present, though only temporary, mortality? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.